Hello, Dr. Gary, and welcome to the channel.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Great. Today, we are going to take a look at an argument for the resurrection of Jesus. In particular, we are going to take a look at Gary Habermas' minimal facts argument. The idea behind it is that there are 6 minimal facts that are agreed on by the vast majority of scholars, and that the best explanation for these facts is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So have you heard about this argument? Do you have any opinion on it? How is it compared to other versions, like William Lane Craig's versions or something?
Yeah, of course. I've dealt with this argument for, 20 years now, I think. I started dealing with it back when it was 12 minimal facts, and then they keep shrinking, and now there's 6, and the empty tomb isn't on it. So that's, if you remember the history of this argument, it is the deflating balloon. It's really it's getting more pathetic over time. But and yeah, you had mentioned when you were planning this with me that you had consulted Habermas's new multi-volume opus that just came out about this, which is already, by his own admission, 10 years out of date. I noticed this when I was looking at it. It's is nothing significant cited in this subject since I didn't see anything significant since 2005. He says he didn't do anything after 2014. So he's admitting it's already 10 years out of date. I think it's worse. I think it's 15 years out of date, maybe 20 years out of date, actually. But in it, he gives the 6, right? And I guess we'll get to that later. But you're asking right now about the form of the argument. And so there's 2 different questions, right? Does the argument logically work if the premises are true? And then you can say, are the premises even true, right? So usually what people do is they'll question the premises, and we'll get to that later. But now the question is, does the argument work if the premises are true? Like you had said, vast majority of scholars agree with all 6 facts. In theory, if you can meet that bar, vast majority, then it is valid at least as an adductive argument. And to explain that, there's in argument when you're going through reasoning, there's the adductive phase where you're coming up with a hypothesis, what's plausible, what should I question, what should I test? Then you have a hypothesis, and then you deduce from the hypothesis what would it predict, and then you go and look for evidence to try and falsify or test that hypothesis. And then that's the inductive phase, that's the evidential phase. The minimal facts argument really is only an adductive argument. It just gets you to a plausible hypothesis, because then once you have the hypothesis, you have to go and test it. And then that's when you run into issues, because there could be, regardless of what scholars think, there could be facts that contradict its conclusion. So you have to actually test the hypothesis once you've gotten that far. And then of course, there's the problem of who are you counting, which scholars are you counting, and so on. So in terms of logic, it's very weak. There's not it's only the beginning of an argument, really. It can't conclusively end the debate on anything, for any argument, right? You can even do minimal facts for global warming or anything like that. It gets you to a plausible hypothesis, but then you still have to test it. And so that's the thing that I don't think the argument works as a conclusive argument. It works as an introduction to an argument. So that said, and we might see some problems and examples of that, but there's a reason why you have to say overwhelming majority of scholars, because if you don't say that, if you say, well, it's just a majority, so let's say 60% scholars agree with fact 1, 60% agree with fact 2, and so on down the line, you actually run into a logical problem, which is the diminishing probabilities. So the question is, are there any scholars who agree with all of them at the same time? And if it's low, if only 10% of scholars agree with all of your facts, well, then the argument doesn't work at all, right? So that's why you can't just isolatedly look at individual facts. You really got to go in there and test. Are there scholars who accept one fact, but because they accept that fact, they reject another fact in there? So there's a lot of different logical possibilities that the argument doesn't take into account, and then you'd have to go in and sort of fill those holes over time. So that's basically why I say it's just an introduction to an argument. It really isn't the end of an argument. But that's the logical form of it, and that's the limitations come very clear when you start testing it, and that's why you run into the problems with it. And that'll come out when we look at the premises. So if we look at the 5 or the 6, what are now the 6 minimal facts, because they've shrunk. They technically shrank to 4, and so really he's sort of defends 5, and then he split it into 6 by turning one of them into 2 of them. But we'll see that as we go. But that's my thought on the argument in general. My main problem with it, though, is really just none of the premises are, most of the premises aren't true, and the ones that are true aren't useful. They don't really argue for the conclusion, and that's what we'll get to when we get to the specifics, I think. Yeah.
Great. So before we get into each premise, like the special thing about this is that, like you said, most scholars agree to them, and what he says at least is that 90% of scholars agree with these premises. Mm-hmm. So what I wanted to ask here is, about maybe we can talk a bit about scholarship consensus and how much importance should we place on the fact that a majority of scholars agree on something.
Right, and that comes to the question of who are we counting when we say scholars. When he made this argument before, when he was trying to push the empty tomb into this, he's rejected. He's abandoned that now. He agrees that most scholars don't agree that the empty tomb is historical, which is kind of a problem for the argument. But anyway, when he was doing that, he would just count basically anyone, right? Like anyone who'd published any article anywhere counted as a point, basically, even if it was the same. Like it's tons of Christian apologists publishing things in magazines and apologetics presses, not academic presses, and so on. He wasn't really distinguishing between like proper peer-reviewed scholarship. That's one problem. And then you get to the problem that most of biblical studies is colonized by religious believers. So this is kind of like saying, 90% of Scientologist scholars agree that Xenu came to Earth, right? Like it's like, that obviously wouldn't work because these are biased scholars, right? These are not like objective scholars in this. So what he needs for this argument, because it's supposed to be an argument to convince someone who's not convinced, right? So it's not an argument, it's not supposed to be an argument for Christians, because Christians are supposed to already agree with this. Since it's supposed to persuade atheists, what he needs is 90% of non-Christian scholars. And so now he has to go and figure out who's a non-Christian scholar, because people don't say that. Like it's hard to research and figure out who's a believer and who's not. Some people hide that about themselves. So that can be very difficult to do, and he hasn't done it. There hasn't been any proper polling of this. We haven't done like a private, anonymous polling where we ask, what is your religious affiliation? What do you think about this fact, etc. No one's done that. And we've done things similar to that, like in philosophy. So we have the Phil Papers surveys scholars with demographic data, like they ask about their beliefs and they ask about like their religion and all that, and then they ask their opinions on specific philosophical questions, and that's super handy. Like you can really get a good insight on what do philosophers think in general, like, right? And they've been doing it every 10 years, so it's been, you can see change over time. We don't have that in biblical studies, so we don't know what, you can't say 90% because you have no measuring tool. And you don't know who you're counting, so you can't really establish that premise. What I think one can do to steel man his point, right, to try and take it as seriously as possible, is say that it seems like a lot of secular scholars agree with the fact, right? Like that, I think that would at least get you the adductive argument that I was talking about. It would get you up to the point of a plausible hypothesis that then you need to test. But he can't even meet that bar. We're going to get to the specifics later. That he can't even establish that because he's playing a lot of word games with how he defines the minimal facts and in terms of their inferences and assumptions and so on. And we'll get to that. But in terms of the logical form, it is a problem that we have a highly biased set that isn't really an objective measure of, should we trust this opinion? Like if we poll everybody, should we trust it? If we polled all American citizens and the majority of citizens said lizard people ruled the earth, should we believe that? And even if it was, all Ph.D. sociologists with professorships, and they all said lizard people ruled the earth, I don't know that we should believe that either. It would depend, right? Like this isn't like a guaranteed result, and so that's why it can get you to a hypothesis that's worth testing, but to get the hypothesis proved, you've got a lot more work to do. You've got to shore up the fact that this opinion is based on something, that the consensus is actually what you call a legitimate rather than fraudulent consensus, that it's or a malformed consensus or a well-formed consensus, and that can, that can change. And as we know, consensus changes, right? So we know the consensus can be wrong, right? Like you look at any field, especially history, there have been consensuses that were overthrown like multiple times throughout history. So we know the consensus can be unreliable. Now that doesn't mean it's useless. It's like I said, it still gives you a sort of a trend line. So that's why you can get this adductive argument out of this, but you can't finish the argument with this, because then you got to do that extra step. You got to start. Okay, so we're relying on scholarly opinion. Now, is that scholarly opinion valid? And then now you've got to what is it based on? What evidence and so on. And so then there's still argument to go. Like you can't get all the way there with just the minimal facts, and that's another reason why.
Right. Yeah. That's good. So, you mentioned the issue of bias, right? Apologia also has say some stuff about this. For example, that many of these scholars, they work for evangelical institutions that make them sign a statement of faith or of principles, and they can lose their jobs if they don't adhere to that. Or some of them are like Catholic priests who work for the church, right? They're not gonna disagree with huge parts of the doctrine, like openly, Yeah. And the kind of person I think that decides to study biblical study or New Testament studies in the first place, right? I think it's not a stretch to say that he's probably a highly religious person, right? So we need to, I don't want to be just like dismissed him, like, no, they're Christians, so they doesn't count, but there is at least your bias one needs to.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right to point that out. The bias is even worse than I was letting on before. I was like, just the belief is a bias itself. Like you need it to be true, so that's going to compromise your judgment. And so, and you can say the same thing of atheists, but then you just run into the same problem. It's like, so if you want to say a majority of scholars agree with atheists, well, you still have to justify that opinion. Like, what is that scholarly opinion based on? Is it justified, et cetera? So the point works both ways. You still have to do the work, and the minimal facts argument by itself isn't doing that work. And so like it wouldn't work even for an atheist perspective to use that argument. But yeah, you mentioned these contracts. There was, by the way, I should point out that Apologia's critique of the Habermas minimal facts argument is the best you're going to find online. So I think like everybody should, and he's really like full on engaging with Habermas's new book and stuff. So like that's some of the best stuff on this so far. In terms of books, the best one lately is Pierce's book on the resurrection. Jonathan M.S. Pierce, you can find that on Amazon. And I actually did a review of it on my blog. So you can find it's the most thorough treatment of this question from a skeptical perspective, of course. But you compare it to what Habermas did, and it's so much better. Like Pierce is doing like serious, hardcore, thorough, up-to-date scholarship on this, whereas Habermas is living in the past and is oversimplifying, and I don't know what's going on there. So anyway, just wanted to throw those two things out there. But you mentioned so David Fitzgerald, he had a team when he wrote his book Mything in Action, Jesus Mything in Action. He got a team to actually contact all the colleges that award degrees in some related field, like biblical studies or New Testament studies, etc. And they found a very like at least a third. By the way, a third had these contracts where, you cannot disagree with the minimal facts, basically. Like, they don't say the minimal facts, but they say you can't disagree with the resurrection and stay employed, right? So, you will be fired. And that's, and there's probably more, because they found a lot of these universities hide this. And they had to do digging to actually, so they'd have universities tell them flat out, no, we don't have one. And then they would find through a document search that in fact they do. So there's universities that are hiding the fact, which is even worse. So not only are they destroying academic freedom, they're hiding the fact that they're destroying academic freedom, which is super suspicious, which means they know that this is wrong, right? Like they know it's wrong, and they don't want to admit it. They don't want to be known for doing it. But that does mean that in this field, unlike other fields of knowledge, this field is seriously compromised in terms of opinions. And that makes the problem I just mentioned earlier worse in this subject. But it's still the same problem, basically. Yeah.
So we can take a look at the first fact then. So fact number 1, Jesus died due to the effects of Roman crucifixion. So, I think, I know that you're a mythicist, but in the context of resurrection debates, I think you usually just grant this fact, like it's like easier. You did this in a previous video. Am I right?
Yeah. In fact, I think that's the most probable. If Jesus existed, and right now that is the consensus. If Jesus existed, then most probably he died on the cross. Now that is, I say most probably. Now, when you say like, well, if you're talking about something improbable happened. Now, if you're granting that, as resurrectionists are, they're saying something wildly improbable happened. He got risen from the dead. But if they're going to allow like wildly improbable things to happen, well, then I get to allow wildly improbable things to happen, and that changes everything, right? So yeah, my opinion is probably historically he died by crucifixion if he existed. But if we're going to ask, well, what is the next? If he didn't die, what's the next most probable thing? Well, there's lots of things that could naturally happen, because the one thing we don't have for this fact is we don't have a death certificate, we don't have a autopsy report, we don't have an inquest. So there's so many ways that can be jimmied, right? So we actually have documented cases of people, even crucified people, who survived, right? And we have documented cases of people who were diagnosed as dead who weren't. So misdiagnosis happens even now today in the modern world. It's even more common back then when medicine was much less advanced, right? And then there's other shit, like we know you can pull cons, right? You could switch in as a twin, or there's like different things that you could do. And then if you look at the story, this is the thing that's especially funny. And Robert Price pointed this out in a chapter I can't remember which. It was one of the Loftus volumes, but the chapter is called "Explaining Resurrection Without the Supernatural" or something like that, and where he explores all of these improbable scenarios. But the significance of these is that they are very improbable. It's just they're many times more probable than a miracle, right? And so this relative probability has to be taken into account. I think there's a lot of black and white thinking by Christians. It is either the most probable thing or it's a miracle. And it's like, no. There's a lot of really improbable natural things that are hundreds of thousands of times more likely than the miracle. And these are some of them. And the Gospels weirdly give you evidence for these things, which is very strange. So, for instance, Jesus dies within 3 hours on the cross. That's really weird and suspicious. He dies immediately after having a sponge with some mysterious fluid on it shoved in his face. That's very curious, right? So, like, you could say, like, you have evidence in there that, they just knocked him out. They passed him off as dead, and then they revived him later, right? Like you can actually make these arguments. And then the response would be, well, but wouldn't he be, like, super wounded and they would know that? And it's like, yeah, but you don't have a line by line, event by event eyewitness account of what happened. Maybe he was all messed up, but that's going to get whitewashed in the story, right? The story you're going to be told is that he was gloriously resurrected. That's what you'll hear, but you weren't there. You don't know like what's being covered up. It's just like Mormonism or Scientology or any of that. Like you don't know what really happened, and most people look at the stories and go, "I think those stories are made up," right? Like I think something else happened, and so on. That could totally happen, right? So I'm not saying that it did happen. I'm saying it's more likely he just died. But if we're going to allow improbable things to happen, then, well, that's actually more probable that he didn't die. And the thing is, for the minimal facts, we don't have evidence that didn't happen. We cannot rule out improbable, natural, alternative explanations of the evidence, right? And so there are alternative explanations in which he didn't die, and all the evidence cites him dying, right? So, like, that can be the case, and we have no way to rule that out. And so that one fact doesn't get you where you want to go, because as soon as you're trying to argue for this miraculous thing, all these improbable, non-miraculous things now become viable arguments again, viable hypotheses again. And so you can't beat them. And yet to get to resurrection, get all the way down the list of possibilities to resurrection, you got to defeat all these other alternatives. Even though they're improbable alternatives, you still have to defeat them. And the evidence doesn't exist to do it. There's even evidence that helps people defend them, which is, a really bad situation for a resurrectionist to be in. Like it's the worst evidential state of affairs. So this first fact is weak at best, right? Is the way I would put it.
Right. So let's look at the second fact. The disciples afterwards reported experiences that they thought were actually appearances of the risen Jesus. Right? So, I think this is probably the most important fact here.
Is it the most important one? Yeah, I guess so. of the 6 that are left. Yeah, maybe this is the most important one. But the thing is this is an example of where the word games get played, right? And I've seen Habermas himself play this game, so I know he plays the game. And what it is, and it happened in the Faith or Fact volume that I have a chapter in commenting on the debate between Carl Stucker and Blomberg. But what happens is they say, we like scholars all agree that, like you quoted it, like the first apostles thought they had experiences that were the risen Jesus. Like worded that way, like that's really vague. Worded that way, that would be correct. Like in literally technically true. I think most secular scholars would agree with that, and I would say 90% probably would agree with that. And as best I can tell, like I said, we don't have any actual data on this, but it seems that way. And I think it's plausible. It's also plausible they made this up. I'll get to that in a moment. But it's entirely believable that they had these experiences. But when we say that, we're talking about anthropology, where we have all these other examples from paganism, other world religions, and so on, of people having exactly the same kind of experiences, where they experience a visitation from the dead, they think it's real, and that's it, right? Like it happens all the time. It happens in multiple religions. It's widely documented outside Western, modern Western cultures, actually. It's much more common in pre-modern and non-Western societies to have these kinds of experiences. And it gets more complicated for antiquity because the words used in Greek, for example, to say that a god appeared to me are not specific to what is meant, and they include dreams. So if you dream a visitation from Jesus and wake up, and you would believe, like there are we have examples from pagans who like have visitations from the gods in their dreams. They believe they're real visitations. Now, we know it's just a dream, but they think it was a real God came to them in their dreams, and they wake up and say, yeah, God appeared to me. And when Paul or anybody else says, Jesus appeared, he doesn't specify. He doesn't say, like, do you mean in a dream? And then, of course, we know waking visions are a thing. We also know, contrary to what Christians say, that you can have mass hallucination. It doesn't work the way they claim, but this is where we get to the word game. So point being is that secular scholars agree that it's probably a dream, waking or asleep, and it could have been they claimed to have these visions and didn't really. But it could also be that they really did. It's entirely plausible. And but then what happens is Habermas will then go to the Gospels and say, yeah, but he showed them wounds and ate dinner with them and sat around with them for, it's like, okay, hold on, you just changed the game, right? You just changed the rules mid-argument. If that's what you mean by appeared, well, now you've lost it. You don't have your 90% anymore, right? You have like almost 0% of secular scholars agree with that the idea that Jesus hung around with them and had dinner and stuff like that. No, they think those are made up stories, right? Like the first appearances appear to be revelatory. And Paul even says, it's not with flesh and blood. It was a revelation only. And it was in me. It was an internal experience. And he doesn't seem to understand there's any difference. Like despite what apologists say, there's no indication in the text of Paul. In fact, it's contraindicated that he thought that people had different experiences than him, though he thinks they're all the same as his. And so like there's no evidence of that. So to term switch between appeared as in revelation, as in a vision you have inside your head, versus an actual meeting a resurrected like physical body that you have dinner with and party with or whatever for weeks on end, those are not the same thing. And so you can't term switch. And so when you stick to the 90% you can get, which is with the internal visions thing, that doesn't get you the resurrection. In fact, it actually is argument now against the actual resurrection. So the minimal facts argument fails there. So you have to play this game where you switch in, you get people to say, 90% agree with visions. Oh, but I'm going to say that I'm going to switch in the narratives of the Gospels now and say that that's what they are saying. Okay, you're breaking the rules, and that's actually an equivocation fallacy. It's formally invalid. So that destroys the argument. So that's the problem with that one. That's where the games get played, and you have to always keep your eye on it. And that's the point I point out in the chapter in the book Faith or Fact, which is that this is the game. It's like you have to realize that Paul is talking about a different thing than the Gospels are. You can't conflate them, but apologists need them to be the same. And that's the step that you can't get. You're not going to get scholars to agree with that step. The evidence doesn't agree with that step. Logic doesn't agree with that step. It just can't be done. And that's where the argument really fails. And I think that's why they think this is the best evidence, is because they're thinking of the narratives in the Gospels as if we had actual rolling video of this. Then wow, that would be really super strong evidence, wouldn't it? And it's like, yeah, I mean, it would be good. I don't know if it would be enough, but it would be definitely good evidence. But you don't have that, right? So it's gone. So that's the problem with that minimal fact.
Yeah. So usually when skeptics suggest that these visions were hallucinations or visions, Gary Habermas has some responses to that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like his most common response, one of his responses is to say, "Oh, hallucinations don't change lives. Like visions or dreams, they don't have like the capacity to perform some life transformative experiences like the kind we see in the disciples." Another one is to say that a bodily resurrection would have been something unexpected for Jews back then, so they wouldn't hallucinate this, or they wouldn't interpret visions in this way. Yeah.
So the first of those, the transformative experience, that is actually one of the 6 minimal facts, isn't it? Or it used to.
Yeah, it's a big kind of kind of a theory.
So that's a separate thing. We'll get to that. So just for the appearance part of it, the fact that, so we'll talk about the other arguments that he makes apart from that one, because that one's just, well, okay, but yeah, we've got another. I agree with you, but we've got another fact. That's the thing, right? Yeah. But the problem is, if you have to argue for it, you've lost the premise, because your premise is supposed to be 90% of scholars agree with it. But that's the point I'm making, is that they don't, right? So you don't have it, right? So it doesn't matter. You can argue for it. Well, now you're not doing minimal facts anymore. You're doing in some other argument, like a William Lane Craig style argument or something. You've abandoned your minimal facts argument. You're saying, well, I don't care that only 10% or 0% of scholars accept this premise. I'm going to keep going. And it's like, well, you've just given up on your whole formula. Like the whole form of the argument is dead at that point. So like his trying to come up with excuses for why all the secular scholars are wrong doesn't work in the form of the argument, because that destroys the minimal facts entire premise, that you need 90% agreement, and you don't have that. And so that's the problem that I'm pointing out with the switcheroo that they play between hallucination or dreaming, which he doesn't deal with at all, and the whole dinner party Jesus is what I like to call it. So anyway, so it doesn't work. Like his trying to make excuses for it doesn't work. The one argument, like you said, transformative argument, that's another fact that we'll deal with separately. And so we'll set that aside till when we get to that. But when we're talking about the appearances thing, this is the problem. Like you can't get your 90%. You can't even get 10% relevant scholars agreeing with you on this premise in any way that would help you for the argument. And that's really where the argument fails, is at that point.
Right. So let's take a look at the third.
Yeah.
These experiences accounted for the disciples' lives becoming totally transformed, even to the point of being willing to die for their belief. Right?
Yeah. So we get to the minimal facts point. Do 90% of secular scholars agree with that? The answer is no, and I think you'll notice that sometimes when he words it, especially when he does the 4 minimal facts version, this is very important, because he's dropped down to 4 from 6. But when he does that, because the dying for their belief, you lose the minimal fact there, because you don't get a majority of secular scholars agreeing with that.
Right.
And the reason is there are even like Christian scholars who don't agree with that, because I think there was someone who did a recent study, Christian scholar, who admitted that actually the evidence for that is really terrible, and we should stop making that argument. That we don't have any evidence of that. We don't have any evidence that anyone, not even a single person, died for that belief. It's hard to even establish if they died for anything at all, because the death accounts are highly legendary. They're poorly sourced. We don't have like eyewitnesses, so we don't actually know why they died, or what the circumstances was, or what they could do, what they could have done to get out of it, etc. And so all the conditions you need aren't met, and so you can't really do that. And that's the empirical problem is already, you're done. Like you can't get your 90% of scholars agreeing with you on that point. There's the other half of that with the transformative part. And I think you could get 90% of scholars agreeing with that something happened that transformed them. But again, we're anthropology, psychology of religion. We have tons and tons of examples of, dreams and visions can radically transform you. Happens all the time. It's normal, actually. Practically every new religion has some sort of dream or vision or transformative experience that you feel, that makes you feel that your beliefs about the supernatural are true, and then people's lives transform. That happened to me as a Taoist back when I was a teenager. I was radically transformed into a spiritual Taoist by a spiritual experience. Now, later, I realized it has a perfectly normal explanation in standard hallucination and altered consciousness theory. Didn't require the supernatural. But the thing is that, absolutely, these kinds of things that these natural hallucinations or dreams that you believe are real, they really will have the same effect on you as the real thing because you believe they're real. That's the thing. So his claim that you mentioned before that the hallucinations and dreams don't have transformative effects is completely false. We know scientifically that it's false. We know that's very common to have that kind of transformative effect because all it comes from is you just have to believe it. It doesn't have to be true. You just have to believe it. If you believe it, then it'll be just as transforming as any other reality would be. And so that's how all religions operate, right? Like that's why there are other religions or many different competing contradictory religions is because of this, that how people feel inside them, they believe is real. It proves whatever supernatural reality they want to claim, which he would call false in almost, every other case. And yet there we are. So that argument doesn't work. Like you get 90% of approval on the transformative part, but you don't get out of the problem that's only a hallucination or dream that's transforming them. And so that doesn't get you to resurrection. And that's the main problem there. When you get to the death part of it, they would die for it. I'd mentioned the empirical problem. There's also the logical problem, which is that we have tons of evidence and examples of hallucinations and dreams transforming people. We know that happens a lot. We also have tons of evidence and examples of people dying for false beliefs. And so would you die for a lie? Well, you'd have to know it was a lie for that to even be relevant, and they might not have. They didn't know. Like, he appeared to me in a dream. I dreamed Jesus. It was really Jesus. What are you talking about that it wasn't real? They could die for that, totally, because they believe it. That's right. Now, we know in hindsight, looking at that, as, oh, shit, they died for a dream. That's pretty sad. But they didn't know that. They wouldn't have known that. But the other side of that is that when you do look at, like, some of the hints that we have of why some of the apostles, or at least believers, died, even if they weren't witnesses. When you look at the actual stories that aren't wildly legendary and the ones that have like any kind of realistic information or believable information, it looks a lot shadier. And so it looks like they're being killed for other things. To give you an example, so Pliny the Younger wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan about this. Now, he wasn't dealing with eyewitnesses. This was like 100 years later, or nearly. But he was dealing with Christians, and he did execute a few of them and tortured a bunch of them and stuff. And was confused by the information he was getting as a result of this. Didn't understand why it was even illegal to be a Christian. Like, what's the problem? And what he came to is he ran some tests, put them through some moral legal tests, and found that they were not willing to basically do the equivalent of saying the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Like, if you imagine, like that's a death penalty offense. If you will not pledge allegiance to the emperor, you are a traitor, and therefore it's death sentence. Now, we think that's really barbaric today, but that's how the law worked back then, right? So when he executes people, he executed them for simply refusing to honor the emperor. That isn't technically what they did, but it's what it looked like to him that they were doing. And so that had nothing to do with what they believed, right? Like, they could sit there and say, recant, like, say, I recant. But then they would have to pay homage to the emperor, which some did. In fact, he said most did. So Christians were really easy to, convince out of their religion, basically. And he said most of the people who were accused of being Christians had left it years before even his trial. So actually, Christianity was super easy to leave. This is actually something that gets overlooked at this. It was only like the super fanatical ones who stayed in. And so the point being is that you can get killed for things. And if Pliny wasn't the nicest, like, he was a nicer guy than some of others, as murderous as he was, he was at least letting them off if they would like recant and pay homage to the emperor, right? Now, there were Christians who said that they could do that and be lying and just to get out of the court trial, but still really believe in Jesus. So there was a whole debate about what does that make you are you unfaithful to Jesus if you do that and stuff. That all there was a big debate about that happened. But there are some of these cases where that wouldn't be an excuse. So you look at like the Acts of I think it's the Acts of Peter that has the legend of Nero executing Peter and Paul, and Nero executes them for like dumb, petty political reasons that have nothing to do with their religion, which means that recanting would not have saved them. Unlike Pliny, where it would have. In that case, they would have been killed anyway. So why would they even bother recanting? Like they might as well die a hero, sticking to the faith. So even if the faith was a lie, they would have died for that lie because why not, right? Because then they're defending their legacy. They're going to die, but they're going to leave. They're going to be revered, right? So that's what they're getting out of that. So yeah, they have definite motive to die for a lie if you're going to die anyway. And so then there are other people who will literally die for a lie because they think the lie is useful. And the lie is important. And this is a sense we get in Paul, where Paul talks about, not directly, but you see the way he talks about Christianity is that he seems to really believe, and certainly he's trying to argue that he believes, that Christianity is just better for society. And they're actually like atheists, like neoconservative and other atheists today, who argue the same thing, that Christianity, even though it's false, it's necessary. Society is better if it's Christian. Now, if you really believe that, and you really believe in dying for the cause, you believe in, like, if your death will actually help the world adopt this system that you think will save it from its sins and its errors and actually make a better world, then you'll absolutely die for a lie, right? Like, because the lie is in service of the goal, and the goal is to get society to behave better by adopting this worldview. So dying for the lie actually serves your mission. Like you would do that in the same as any other hero would die for anything else, any other cause they believed in. So dying for a lie is a thing that would happen. And we have close to examples of that kind of thing where people will do that. You look in Mormonism too, if Joseph Smith died for his faith, right? Now you could say, well, I mean, he kind of technically died for other reasons or whatever, but that's the same problem, right? Like even if you say he died for political reasons and not his religion, he didn't recant either. So, he died for a lie, and so did many other Mormons did. So that doesn't help, right? So the whole dying for a lie thing doesn't work logically. It doesn't work empirically because we don't have any evidence that even really happened in any relevant sense. And so that doesn't work. And that's why you can't get the 90% of scholars. You can't even get 10% of scholars to agree that anybody died for a lie on that. And then when that leaves the other half of that, which is transformation, which we know abundant science establishes that, yeah, obviously dreams and hallucinations can transform people. So that can be true. You can get 90% to agree to half of that minimal fact, but that doesn't get you to the resurrection. And so it's not useful for the argument. And that's the problem with that one. And that works together with the other one about hallucination and dreams that kind of just kills the whole argument for the resurrection altogether, which is why secular scholars don't buy the resurrection argument, is that those two facts just don't go the way that Habermas wants them to go, and that kind of just puts the end to the whole thing.
Right. Great, thanks. So let's take a look at the next fact. The proclamation of Jesus' resurrection and appearances took place very early, soon after the experiences themselves. So yeah, most of the support from this comes from 1 Corinthians 15, which is a pre-Pauline creed, and I heard some people saying that it can be dated to only a few years after the resurrection, right? So what they are trying to do here is like try to debunk the skeptic scenario that the resurrection is a legend that evolved like many decades after the fact, right? This is like the end of it.
Yeah.
What do you think of this?
Yeah, this is another example where I don't know how the poll would come out on this. I have the impression that 90% of secular scholars would agree with this fact. I certainly do. I think the evidence establishes that the creed was immediate. It wasn't decades later. Although this gets to the question of the conflation in the earlier fact about what legend are we talking about? Are we talking about the belief in the resurrection, or are we talking about the dinner party Jesus stories? Right. Those are decades later. Those didn't appear early on, and so that kind of like kills the argument for the resurrection. But if you go back and you abandon that and you admit that, okay, we're just talking about, Peter had a dream, Jesus visited him in the dream, he believed it was really Jesus, and he woke up and says, Jesus risen from the dead, and started the whole cult and whatever. Like immediately. That's entirely plausible, and I think like most, I don't know if 90%, but I would say like most secular scholars agree that that's what happened. And even if it isn't what happened literally, it is definitely what Peter was claiming happened. And so we have the example of Joseph Smith, like, he's claiming a revelation of the angel Moroni, complete with the magical golden plates and all that stuff. Pretty much everybody agrees that that's all made up. Joseph Smith's a liar. Like that didn't happen. But it was from day one. Like, it didn't take decades for that legend to develop. No, the legend was spun day one. And that's how the religion began, and it grew and is a massive global religion competing with mainstream sects of Christianity today. So we know that can happen, right? So we know you can make up the vision, and that ties into back to what I was talking about before. Like, why did Joseph Smith do it? Like, I think he had, well, first of all, he had self-interested reasons, but he also had like his idea of, he wanted the world to be a better place, and in his idea, like what he thinks that means. And of course, he wanted the fame and legend and reverence and reputation of being the guy who did it, right? Like, so I think there's some of that. And like any cult leader, like he wants to be the bigwig, he wants to be the important person, and control his own little cabal, his own little society, and so on. So he had those motivations, and they were sufficient for him to lie and to importune other witnesses to lie as well. And so like it's the same kind of, so you can say that Christianity could have began the same way. We have no particular evidence against that. I also don't think we have any particular evidence for it. I think the evidence we have is vague, so it's 50-50. Whether Paul means real visions or pretended visions, is it just, were these people thinking that we could make society better if we can convince people to believe this thing? And the thing they really thought was important was society believing the thing, not the thing being true. The thing being true wasn't relevant. And we have this thinking already encapsulated in Plato's Republic, where Plato actually outright says and gives an extended philosophical defense for exactly this thinking, where he says that, yeah, the myths aren't true, but the people need to believe them, and the world will be better if they believe them. And so we should set up a hierarchy and even use force to compel people to believe these things, even though the people at top know they're not true. And therefore that motivates everything, dying for it, doing everything for it, because the mission is to reform society, and that's more important than the myth being literally true. The myth is just an instrument to obtain the goal. And there's a lot of evidence that Paul thought this, that this is his thinking about how he thought Christianity was important. He thought it was important for that reason, that it made things better and it was worth dying for that reason. Its truth is kind of like irrelevant to that, right? Like, so that's the problem that we get to in terms of trying to figure out, were these visions real or not? At the same time, we have lots of evidence that Paul was a schizotypal, that he hallucinated a lot. He had conversations with Jesus in his head all the time and thought they were real. So like he just probably was one of these guys who just, had that kind of personality and thought he was really talking to Jesus in his head. That's also entirely possible. So if there's evidence either way, we can't decide it. So in terms of what secular scholars would say about that, I'm not sure because I haven't seen a poll, but it's 50-50 either way. So that it being early is not relevant to it being real. We know that like false beliefs can arise immediately. And it's the thing is, if you dream Jesus visiting you and you believe it, and you believe what he told you because he's God, so why would he lie to you? So like now like the day one, you're going to believe it. So like it being early doesn't solve this problem. It doesn't really argue for the supernatural alternative to the normal scientific explanation of all religions, basically.
Yeah. That's great. So let's move on to the next fact. So James, the brother of Jesus and a skeptic before his conversion, most likely believed after he also thought that he saw the risen Jesus. So in my opinion, this is probably like the weakest minimal fact, because the support for James being a skeptic is so little. They get it from one tiny sentence in the gospel where it says that his family, Jesus' family, didn't believe in him, and they thought he was crazy, right? But that's ill. It doesn't mean like all of his family were like super skeptic. We don't know what degree of skepticism they had.
No, you're right. You're right to think that it's worse than that. Actually, it's worse than that. But you're right to think that. For that thought to come to you is apt. It's also worth pointing out that I know, because the sixth fact is going to be Paul. I know where we're going. He used to have these together as one fact. It was the fact that skeptics were converted. Right. His two examples were James and Paul. Those are the only two examples, which is important. We'll get to that when we get to Paul. The fact that there's only two examples and really only one example is actually an argument against the resurrection, and I'll explain that when we get to the Paul, the last sixth fact. But for the James fact, you're right. There's really no basis for this belief, and in fact, there's evidence against it. So one of the evidences is that Acts 1 says all the brothers are part of the religion, like they were just there. And there's no evidence that they were skeptics, because it looks like they were just believers all the time. Now, the only instance where we have like any hint that he might have ever been a skeptic, and it doesn't name him as the skeptic or anything. It just says that Jesus' family were a bit doubtful, and there's a passage where he disowns them to create an etiological myth for the fictive family of Christian brethren, right? Like saying, you're my real family, those aren't my family, yada, yada. Right. Probably a made-up story. It's a classic example in anthropology of what's an etiological myth is a myth that explains an institution or a doctrine, and the doctrine is fictive kinship. So you make up a story to explain that, etc. It's very common. Usually these myths are myths. They're usually not real stories, not real causes of the origins of these beliefs, but you tell these stories, these just so stories, to explain why we do this. Why do we have fictive kinship? Well, let me tell you a story about Jesus, yada yada. And so there's no evidence in Paul that happened, right? There's no evidence in Paul that James was ever a doubter. And even 1 Corinthians 15, which mentions a James, doesn't say it's the brother of Jesus, which is peculiar. So we don't know which James that was. And it doesn't really say that James was converted from skepticism. It just says that an appearance to James occurred. But it also occurred to Peter and the 12, and they weren't skeptics. They were believers, right? So, and the other thing is that it gets worse. It appears to above 500 brethren. That appearance happens before the appearance to James is listed. Even if that's real, we can get a whole side question of has the text become corrupted? Was this really what Paul wrote, etc.? But the point is, in that narrative, there's nothing about James being a skeptic and then being converted by the appearance. It's not there. So it's all hypothetical. And hypotheses are not facts. So you're kind of hosed there. You can't really get this in. You could say at best it's 50-50. Maybe he was a skeptic. We don't really know. And so the question for minimal facts is what percentage of secular scholars would agree that James was a skeptic? I don't know that what that percentage is. Maybe 50-50 or whatever. I doubt it's 90%, right? So even if you get 60%, that means 40% is against you on this. So it can't meet the standards for minimal facts. And that's the problem. And even if you could get 90% of secular scholars agreeing with it, that runs into the problem of why do they agree with it? Is it a sound reason? And you can show that it wouldn't be. There is no sound reason to be confident that this is true. And so regardless of scholarly opinion, the facts don't bear it out. Like the evidence and logic doesn't hold up for this. It doesn't disprove it either, but it can't be established as a premise. That's the problem. And so that really, I think we have to wash this out. I don't think we can count this as good evidence at all. Like you call it the weakest evidence. I think if it's 50-50 chance it's true, then it has no effect on the probability of the resurrection, because 50-50, cancels out to 1. Anything multiplied by 1 is itself. So the probability is unaffected by this fact if it's 50-50 at best, and that's what it is. So this fact is you really have to chuck it. I'm surprised it survived this long, because there's even evidence against it, and there's no really good evidence for it, and it's all just a modern apologetic legend, really. I should point that out, it is a modern apologetic legend. There's no ancient legend that James was a skeptic who was converted by surprise later. That's no ancient Christian author talks about that. So they didn't know about this theory that James was a skeptic who was converted later. And if they didn't even know about it, well, it wasn't even a legend, much less a true fact. So yeah, it's just a modern theory. It's poorly evidenced theory, and so it can't get you the results you want here.
Right. There is one additional thing one can say here. In fact, the notion of his family did not believe in Jesus, if anything, is kind of unrealistic, because when you think about it, Mary had an angel appearing to her and telling her about who was Jesus and all of that.
Yeah.
And she knows that she was a virgin.
Right,
and she
right.
gave birth to Jesus. Okay, how could she later possibly be a skeptic of Jesus? That doesn't make sense. So
That's a really good point.
This is problematic, and it adds to the unrealisticness of the story, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm always arguing from the assumption of mainstream scholarship, right? And I forget that we're talking about Christian apologetics, because Gary Habermas is not a mainstream scholar at all. So yeah, he totally believes in the nativity story. Obviously secular scholars don't. They think that's all made up. But if you bought into that, like if that's your position, then you cannot consistently hold. Habermas himself cannot consistently hold the position that James was a skeptic and angels appeared to Mary and Joseph and all of that, right? Like, and plus all the miracles, Jesus, everything Jesus did, like all like this. For James to be a skeptic would be just wildly implausible, given the story as told. So the only way to get this fact in, even for Habermas, even for him to get this fact in, he has to openly say to the world, "Oh yeah, the Gospels are all bullshit," which he's not going to do, right? So that's the thing. You're right. Like if you're in a position of like Habermas, where you have to affirm the fundamentals, the basic truth, even if it varies in outline of the Gospels, nativities and all, right? Like the miracles of Jesus, and nativity, like everything that happened. If you're going to embrace that, then the skeptical James is not a plausible hypothesis anymore, which means you need even more evidence for it than you would need normally, and we don't even have enough evidence to back it normally. So yeah, that's a really good point. That this creates a fundamental, irreconcilable contradiction in Habermas's own worldview. So yeah, that's also true. But from the perspective of secular scholars, obviously they don't think that. Obviously, James could be a skeptic from a secular point of view, because Jesus was basically, a huckster. He wasn't a real miracle worker, and there wasn't any angel appearing to Mary and all of that. So yeah, it's interesting. That's another kind of conflation fallacy, where we're talking about secular scholars' opinions, and then we're going to suddenly substitute in this idea that, and hope this doesn't create a contradiction, that all the Gospels are true and the nativity really happened and all that. Yeah. That's also a problem, and so that's a problem it's an internal problem for Christians trying to use the minimal facts apologetic.
Yeah. So now we can get to the last minimal fact. This is the conversion of Paul. Just a few years later, Paul also became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also concluded was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. Right? So yeah, how much do you agree with that? How much do this prove, like the conversion of Paul?
Yeah, so in a sense, I covered that. Like, I personally don't know whether Paul was pretending to have had these experiences or he really did. I lean in favor of he really did, because I think some of the crazy shit he says is unmotivated and therefore is indicative of him believing these things. But who knows? He could have been a really exceptional liar as well. And we also know he lied about stuff. So he's definitely not the most honest fella. And, Joseph Smith pulled this off too. So we know it can be done. But I lean, like, balance of probability, just barely. I lean in the favor of Paul really having this experience. Now, Paul himself says that it was an internal experience. It was a vision. It was not flesh and blood. And it was from heaven. It was a celestial Jesus appearing to him in some sense. It could have been a dream. He could have dreamed Jesus and believed it was real. That's totally normal for back then. Could have been a waking vision, also well documented scientifically, religiously, and so on. So that's entirely possible. And as I mentioned before, like, if you believe it's real, it'll have the exact same effect on you psychologically as a real thing. So there's no trouble explaining why it would transform Paul. So the question would be, and because Paul actually says this, so like we're not even conjecturing or hypothesizing, that he had a vision of Jesus. He outright says that it wasn't a physical Jesus, that it was this revelation inside him. And he even talks about later, like he has regular conversations with Jesus in his head. Like this is in 2 Corinthians 12, like where he's talking about like he just talks to Jesus and thinks it's really Jesus. Like it's not like he's schizophrenic talking to himself, but it's really it's Jesus he thinks he's talking to. And he has these conversations and thinks they're real. And so because he thinks it's real, obviously it's going to affect him. He's going to act in exactly the same way as someone would act if it really did happen. And so that is fully explanatory. Usually the idea behind this, so let's get back to the minimal facts concept. Like, where are scholars on this? I think they're probably where I am, 50-50, maybe 60-40, that Paul really had this experience. And even if you're on the 40% side, you would agree that he claimed to have this experience and early on and so on. And he did convert from a skeptic. This is a good example where we can prove, at least to a reasonable probability, that he was a skeptic. He was hostile to the church, and that he converted and became a leader within the church. So that's uncontroversial. It's just we have a lot of examples of that happening in other religions and other political ideologies and other worldviews, so that it is never evidence that the switched religion is true, unfortunately, right? Like you have people who have experiences, they're diehard Christian, they have an experience that converts them to Islam. Does that prove Islam is true? No. I mean, when I was converted to Taoism, which even if I was a devout Christian, I could have been converted to Taoism by the same experience. Would that have proved Christianity false and Taoism true? No, obviously not. So this doesn't get us to where Habermas wants to go. The interesting question that gets asked, though, is like, why would this happen, right? Why would this hostile guy have a hallucination or a dream of Jesus telling him he's wrong and has been persecuting God's own church and so on? And this gets back to what I was mentioning before, there's a lot of clues dropped in Paul's letters. Like, it seems pretty clear to me that at some point he had a eureka moment and realized that Christianity is better. And I mean like socially better. It's better in a number of different ways. And so for him to be against it was clearly, if you think of like, what is the best way for society to live? Well, obviously that would have to be God's way, because God is all wise and so on. So if you come to this realization that Christianity is actually a better system than traditional Judaism, then, or even better at whatever, like better at getting Gentiles into the church, better at creating pacifist communities that take care of each other, like whatever it is you think is better, and you believe that God always backs what's better, then you would automatically believe that God must endorse this, and therefore you would automatically believe that Christianity must be true, right? So like if you're convinced of the functional utility of Christianity, back then, that mindset would automatically transition you to believing that God is backing Christianity. And then all you need is like, if this is the thing you're struggling with, especially if you've been tormenting people, like you start to have a conscience problem, right? So you're kind of stuck in this, well, what do I do? What do I do? Well, obviously your tension in your mind, if you're a schizotypal, is going to cause you to have a dream or a hallucination or whatever that resolves this psychological conflict in you. And so it's expected psychologically for Paul to do this. Now, this requires a confluence of unusual circumstances, right? For all of this stuff to come together for Paul to have that transition. And say, well, isn't that improbable? I'm going to say, yeah, that's why it only happened once. And this is where this fact actually is an evidence against the resurrection. And I made this point in my article, my chapter on the resurrection in The Christian Delusion, the Loftus edited volume. And which is still kind of like one of my definitive articles on the resurrection and why it's not believable. But I make this point that, what should happen is that for hostiles to convert would require a convergence of circumstances that is not going to be common. Consequently, if Christianity is false, we expect very few hostiles to convert. We do not expect zero hostiles to convert. We expect there will be hostiles, but they'll just be rare, because you have to have these accidental confluences of events, which means it's not a miracle. It's not real Jesus. You have to have confluence of natural events that requires random chance, right? And so like the effect that what we would observe is we observe very few of these, and that's what we observe. We can only really count one in the first generation of Christianity, because like we said with James, we can't even establish that one. But even if we could establish that one, that would be two. right? Two enemies of the church convert. Like that's evidence that the resurrection isn't real. That's evidence of natural causes of conversion, right? So that's this fact actually runs against them. And I point out, like, well, what you would expect if the resurrection was real, and this is how you do proper hypothesis testing. This is why minimal facts is a terrible method. It's only adductive. It's not proof. It's not the argument side. It's the adduction side of the hypothesis. Is that you need to test the hypothesis, and to do that, you have to deduce what do the different hypotheses predict, and what do you observe? Which prediction set comes more true than the other? And if the resurrection was real, well, that Jesus should have appeared to the Senate of Rome, should have appeared to all the temples in China, should have, you know what I mean? Like, it would be like, why wouldn't he appear to all the hostiles and convert them all? And the only ones who would resist would be the rare few who have the rare confluence of circumstances that make them so hostile that they reject even the appearance of Jesus. And so that hostiles converting should be the norm, and the hostiles resisting should be rare. Whereas if you look at the other side, if the natural cause theory, it's the other way around, where hostiles converting should be rare, hostiles resisting should be the norm. And what do we observe? We observe the natural causal hypothesis scenario. Predictions come all true there. And I have many more examples of this, of how the prediction set matches natural causes in, I think, The End of Christianity, which is the other John Loftus volume that I have a resurrection chapter on. And I talk about that, like the Christianity, all the things are, and where I have a summary of my book, Not the Impossible Faith, which goes into this in much more detail of how Christianity actually fits its circumstances, like, and natural causes better than a supernatural cause theory, which makes very little sense of the sequence of events. We should see much more like amazing supernatural outcomes, like tons and tons of hostiles having visitations of Jesus and being converted. That's what we should see, and we don't. And so the hypothesis is falsified. So even if the minimal facts hypothesis was a good adductive argument for the hypothesis, once you get to hypothesis testing, it's massively falsified, and so it's thrown out. So like that, it doesn't survive. And this last minimal fact is the clue to what really does it in, is that it doesn't match the prediction set. And so it's falsified. It's a falsified hypothesis, and that's just the end of it, right? And I think that's where most secular scholars are, and that's why we're not impressed by this argument.
Yeah. So one thing they could say to that, like, if we don't want to say that Paul was lying, and we want to say, okay, Paul maybe was having an hallucination, one thing that they could say is to bring out his blindness. According to Acts, Paul was blinded after his hallucination for 3 days. And they could say, like, okay, hallucinations don't do this, right? You don't hallucinate and then you go blind for 3 days, right? Like this, they could say something like this, right?
Have you heard people say that? I haven't heard. That's an interesting argument. I haven't heard that one tried before. It's funny because it's false, because we actually know. Like, there's a whole book. What is it called? I can't remember. It's a book about psychosomatic illnesses. It's a great book that I often recommend for this. Oh, here it is. I got it. It's Edward Shorter's book, From Paralysis to Fatigue, A History of Psychosomatic Illness in the Modern Era. And one of the ones that's very common, like one of the most common, well, not most common, but it's a very common psychosomatic illness is blindness. Psychosomatic blindness. In other words, some sort of psychological trauma or psychological effect causes you to believe you're blind, and so you are. And so it's blindness. It's not a trauma it's not an injury to the eye or the optic nerve or the brain or any of that. No, it's purely a psychological effect where you just stop seeing. And so psychosomatic blindness, now there are debates as to whether it's real or pretended, but it doesn't matter because the effect is the same and would get reported the same. So even if Paul was not really blind, but believed he was and said he was and acted like he was, that's what the report would say, is that he went blind. So even if that story was true, it completely agrees with what we know about psychosomatic illnesses. And we know schizotypals are particularly prone to psychosomatic illnesses. And we have tons of evidence that Paul was schizotypal because he acts like it all the time in his letters and so on. So that doesn't work, even if you believe the story in Acts, and I don't. But because we don't really know if Acts is making this up. We don't know if it has a source. And Acts is super unreliable. It makes up stuff all the time. It lies a lot. So the author of Acts is super unreliable. So we really couldn't even trust this, even if it were real. Or we couldn't trust even if it said this, we couldn't trust it. But even if it were real, if we trusted it, it actually fits known phenomena of the time, or of human psyche in general. So yeah, that argument wouldn't work. It wouldn't rescue anything here.
Right. Okay. So we have like about 20 minutes. I think we have time to look at another fact that is not part of Habermas facts, but other apologists use it very much, like Craig, and it's the empty tomb, or also the burial of Jesus. It's two different things, but I recently read Dale Allison's book on the resurrection. It was very good, and one of the things he says is that he has different arguments than Craig's. He says, because Craig says, for example, that points to the fact that the women finding the tomb. But I think that argument is super bad. It has been debunked many times. I don't think that argument works. Dale Allison has a different argument. He says that the narration in Mark appears to have little signs of legend and that it looks like a memory. And he also says something very interesting. He says that if this had been a literature, an invention, the authors who would have been eager to include a verse in the Old Testament that says, "Then they made his resting place with the wicked." And they had an opportunity to say that the thieves got buried with Jesus, right? But they didn't do this. And in his opinion, this implies that the story of burial, of the finding of the empty tomb, that the whole thing is true, right? He also has an additional reason. He says that it will be given the situation, the problematic situation between Jews and Christians in the back then, it will be weird to invent someone like Joseph of Arimathea, like doing the right thing. He says Christians wouldn't be likely to invent something like that, right? So, you ever heard of this? What do you think of this?
So yeah, let me quickly. I want to make sure I have my language right in this. Yeah, because the thing about Isaiah, burial place. So the thing about Isaiah is, it doesn't just say, what it says is they made the wicked with the wicked his grave, but with the rich at his death. Now, Mark reverses this. He has the wicked at his death, because Jesus is killed with the criminals, right? And he has the rich man at his death, which is Joseph of Arimathea. So he's actually satisfied the scripture in a loose way, right? He's met that it's both with the wicked and with the rich in his death. One might wonder, and this is a thing that we know that manuscripts. We know two things. We know Mark was relying on targums a lot, which are Aramaic paraphrases of Isaiah. So his idea of what Isaiah said might differ from what our Isaiah said. But also those manuscripts of that time of Isaiah also said different things, right? And so there's a lot of variant readings. And so it'd be entirely plausible that those terms got switched in his version of Isaiah, either the Targum that he was reading or the Hebrew version that he was reading. Entirely plausible that happened. Or it's possible he just decided himself to switch them because it was useful for him to do that. It was useful for him to do that because, especially if Mark knows the actual law, and he does seem to. There's several scholars. I have a whole chapter on this in The Empty Tomb, edited by Lauder and Price, on the burial of Jesus. And I talk about the burial laws of this time. And Mark's story, there's several scholars who've made this point. I'm not the only one, and I cite them there. There's some of them there. Is that Mark's story actually fits what we know, which is that Jesus actually would have been buried with criminals. In fact, he was legally required to be. And Joseph of Arimathea only puts him in the tomb overnight, or for the Sabbath, only for the Sabbath. because there wasn't enough time to get him into the criminal graveyard where he was legally required to go. And we have examples of this in law where it was allowed to temporarily store a body because the Sabbath was approaching, and then get it to its proper burial place later. But of course, Jesus rises from the dead before that can happen. Or supposedly, maybe he got moved to the criminal graveyard and they mistook it as being empty. But anyway, there's a lot of ways you could go with that. But the point being is that Marx actually fits the narrative pretty well, which shows that he understands how the laws work. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is a real story. And in fact, the evidence suggests that Mark is making all this up. There's tons of evidence of that. It way overwhelms this kind of super weak argument that you just made, that you just repeated about it. There's so much of it is constructed out of scripture. So much of it is constructed out of other stories of empty tombs, because this was a very popular motif, is to have the missing body. It's all over the place in ancient literature. And then Matthew sees it as a good parallel for the Daniel in the lion's den, and it's very possible Mark was already seeing that too and doing that. And then, of course, the biggest proof is that Matthew comes up with this story to explain away that you stole the body, right? But the fact that story didn't exist when Mark was writing, because Mark didn't know that he had to respond to this argument that, the empty tomb means the body was stolen. Matthew comes up with that, which means that in between Mark and Matthew, people were reacting to Mark's story with a polemic, and Matthew writes a response to that polemic into his story, which means that Mark invented the empty tomb story, because for 30, 40 years, no one had ever heard of an empty tomb story to react to by saying that there was, we just stole the body, right? So by the time Mark wrote, there was no existing debate and polemic for him to respond to, because that story hadn't been invented yet. And so that's just one of many examples of this. I talk about this. I have, Why Did Mark Have an Empty Tomb? It's not the title. It's something like that on my blog. I summarize all of this evidence that it's obviously made up. So that argument doesn't hold. There's too many arguments and evidence against that conclusion that they sort of few weak arguments for it can't overcome. Like this, you can't win that argument. It's a loser of an argument. And it's similar to, like you'd mentioned, the women. Briefly, you mentioned that women argument. It's worth pointing out because we're doing Habermas's minimal facts. Habermas himself agrees with me on this, which is, and he says this early on. I can't remember, like 2012. I can't remember how far. Somewhere way back there, he admits that most scholars agree that the whole argument that they wouldn't have women weren't trusted as witnesses. He agrees that that's false. That was a modern apologetic. That there's no evidence of this idea that women's witness was not trusted in antiquity. It's false. So that whole apologetic isn't true. It was something made up lately. And Habermas realizes that that's why you can't have that argument. It doesn't work. So even he agrees that argument doesn't work. And that and many other things has led him to drop the empty tomb, because you can't even get above 50%, much less 90% of secular scholars agreeing with the historicity of the empty tomb. In fact, it's really low percentage of agreeers versus agnostics or deniers, right? And it's another thing, you have to count agnostics as a thing that people forget. And so anyway, so that argument doesn't work. Like, that's just a wash. And I think it's similar with Allison's argument as well. And you mentioned one other. What was that third argument? That last one you did?
Well, Allison says that Christians will be unlikely to invent someone like Joseph of Arimathea being the good guy, because they were like very anti-Jew, and they had a lot of problems with Jews at that point. So he says this will be weird to make an invention, right? That's a surprising argument. I'm surprised that I don't remember him making that argument. That's kind of weird, because when Mark is definitely a Pauline. Mark himself might be a Gentile, but the full-blown anti-Semitism, that's decades later. So when Mark's writing, like, they're not anti-Jew, they're anti-Jewish elite. They actually are integrative. So like Paul was an integrator. He wanted Jews and Gentile Christians to get along. He wasn't like anti-Semitic. He wasn't like the Jewish Christians are all fuck them. They have nothing to do with them. That wasn't his attitude at all. And Mark doesn't show that attitude either. When Mark has passages that look critical of Jews, it's critical of the Jewish elite. Even when it looks like he's criticizing the crowd, it's because of the influence of the elite. He's very clear on this.
So he's attacking the sort of stuffy aristocratic Jews, not Jews. It's an important distinction.
Joseph, okay.
When we get to Joseph, now that's why. So this is actually the mythological reason why Mark does this. First of all, it says this prophecy says with the rich in his death, right? So there's got to be a rich guy in there. Yeah. Who's it going to be? And Mark clearly knows burial law, so he knows the body has to be buried before sunset. That's Torah law. That's like clear-cut law in Jewish concept. So somebody's got to bury him. It's got to be somebody who respects the Sabbath. It's got to be a rich guy. Well, who's left? It's got to be some member of the Jewish elite has to go apostate and say, I'm going to be, unlike all you guys that are like disregarding the law, I'm going to stand up for the law and bury this guy, even though we hate him, even though we voted to kill him, whatever. It's still our moral obligation to do it. That actually makes perfect sense to show that there are some Jews who really aren't hypocrites, who really do stand by their principles. And it gets you to put this guy in there. So you get the rich guy. He has to be Jewish, some rich Jewish guy. The name Arimathea, so Arimathea is Greek for best disciple or best teaching. So you have a guy who follows the best teaching, who actually follows the law, and you know what I mean? Like this, and then he's named Joseph, which is the patriarch, and a famous patriarch, also associated with the famous burial story, and so on. So like it's just so obviously made up. It's exactly in the interests of Mark to have a member of the council do this, and to name him Joseph, and to make him from the fictional town of Arimathea, and carry all this out. Like that's totally sensible. And in reality, that like if in historical fact, that is exactly what would have happened. Because the idea that the whole Sanhedrin would not bury the guy, that's inconceivable. Like absolutely, that would be like really like everybody would be condemning them as breaking the law, right? Like they can't do that. They have to be upstanding in the public eye. So they absolutely would have buried him. They're required by law to bury even the executed criminal. It's Torah law. It's like squarely in there before sunset, right? Too. So just exactly like Mark depicts, like they'd have to do that. Which means they would have sent someone to do it. Like historically, absolutely, 100%. That's what would have happened. And Mark knows that. So when he's writing this fictional story, there's nothing weird about having one of them do this. Like that fits exactly like that's plausible fiction for him. Like that. So it wouldn't be like he wouldn't have thought any of the things that Allison is attributing to him. But I'm going to like make it anachronistic and contrary to how it would really work because I hate the Jews so much that I don't want them to be doing anything good. Like that's not at all in Mark's mindset, right? So that's just not happening. And so that's a super bad argument. I'm kind of surprised that he would make an argument like that.
I have a question there. Luke says at some point that Joseph of Arimathea took courage. It took courage for him to go to Pilate and ask for the body. But my question is, if it's so normal, if it was like his job or was what he was obviously supposed to do, why then it wouldn't make sense for him to need courage to do this work? Yeah,
again, Luke is a great fiction author who lies a lot, so that's can't do anything with that. But the sort of intern and like the historical fiction aspect of that, it's like why would Luke as an author write that? And the reason is not the burial aspect of it; it's that he died in 3 hours, right? And Mark, I think even Mark makes a point of this that 3 hours is weirdly fast. Like I think even he has Pilate react like really he's dead already. So, and in terms of like realism, like it would be like a romantic comedy today where someone says, "Hey, I have cancer," and they die a half an hour later, right? Like that's like half an hour. Like cancer usually get at least a month, right? Like it would be weird, right? So if you're doing the fiction, like it wouldn't work. That would be strange. There's a particular like theological reason why Mark has Jesus die fast. Like the timeline there's like mythical reasons why he's doing this. So that's explained. But if you're going to have like Joseph of Arimathea, like go collect the body, well, you've got this narrative problem now. It's like, whoa, like, who's going to persuade volatile, angry Pilate that the guy's dead and that you're supposed to follow Jewish laws. And, oh, by the way, your emperor signed a treaty with us allowing us to follow our laws. Like, you're going to talk back to Pilate like this guy who like randomly murders crowds of Jews who get uppity. No, that totally makes sense. Like, you'd be really scared to like, this is a diplomatically difficult situation. It's like, look, we got to follow our law. I know you don't like it, but like we do, it is a treaty with you guys. And it's really important. It could be a riot. It's in your best interest. Trust me, it's in your best interest to let us do this. Yeah, that would require some courage, I think. So I think that's plausible fiction for sure.
Sure. Okay, that's great. Yeah, I think this we cover like all the facts so far.
Yeah, well in time too. Like these are good. You get like little. You could even break it into little pieces and have like shorts out of it. Yeah.
So if you have any like conclusion or any final outro or some concluding word for this.
Yeah, I would say like final thoughts on this is, I've been doing this for over 20 years now, well over 20 years. And so this is like one of my areas of top expertise is the arguments for and against the resurrection. I've read like practically everything. I've heard practically everything. I've had hundreds of debates, dozens of live debates. Like I've done this a lot for a long time. And so I have a lot of writing. Like, people can go to my blog, richardcarrier.info.info. You can find my books there. You can find my articles in there. I think there's even a resurrection category in my category drop-down menu on the right margin and so on. So if you want to go further into this, that's the place to go. And on my blog, I have an article. It's just Guide to My Social Media. If you search for Guide to My Social Media, it explains how to interact with me if you have questions. So the best thing to do is to put a comment on a blog article that's about the thing you want to ask about. So like if it's resurrection, empty tomb, dying for a lie, whatever it is, find that article, add a comment, and just ask a question. It'll take a while. It goes through moderation, etc., but I'll get a response to that. I'll answer those things as long as you're asking like sincere questions about stuff. So if people still have questions about this, like I have a voluminous knowledge of this subject, that's the place to go to follow up. And I think there might be some links. I don't know if you're going to put links under the video for people. It'll be like the quick access points for all of this to do. And so that's where I recommend. And just in general, what I would tell people and leave people with is the number one sort of overarching like flaw in Christian apologetics, all arguments Christians make, is argument by omission. And what I say is that the way I put it is that they always leave something out that when you put it back in, reverses the conclusion. So whenever a Christian is making an argument to you, the first thing you should look for is not try to debunk what they're telling you. The first thing what you should do is what are they leaving out? They're leaving something out. And then go find that. And usually once you find it, you've already debunked. You'll have everything you need to know to debunk what they're saying. You just got the argument is in what's being omitted, and that's harder for you to see because it's being hidden from you. Right, you're being presented with a list of facts or an argument you're supposed to respond to, but the trick is what's absent. And so what I would say is you always got to look for that, no matter what the argument is. Figure out what they're leaving out. There's something they're leaving out, and if you notice, if you go back through this video, every single one, there's something they left out that when you put it back in, kind of destroys the facts. And that's every single point I made throughout this is an example of that. Something's being left out, and that's always the thing to look for. To diffuse any Christian apologetics. And this video gives you tons of examples of doing that. So you can like learn by example here. So I think that's the main lesson I would want people to take away.
That's great. Great. Thank you very much. So so you hear, guys, so feel free to go check out his blog. He has a lot of useful resources. And well, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and see you next time. Bye.